Book 3, Chapter 13 of the late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dennis Sayers. The late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great by Henry Fielding. Book 3, Chapter 13. Something concerning Fireblood which will surprise, and somewhat touching one of the Miss Snaps, which will greatly concern the reader. However, notwithstanding all these censures abroad, and in despite of all his misfortunes at home, Heartfree in Newgate enjoyed a quiet, undisturbed repose, while our hero, nobly disdaining rest, lay sleepless all night, partly from the apprehensions of Mrs. Heartfree's return before he had executed his scheme, and partly from a suspicion lest Fireblood should betray him, of whose infidelity he had nevertheless no other cause to maintain any fear, but from his knowing him to be an accomplished rascal, as the vulgar term it, a complete great man in our language. And indeed, to confess the truth, these doubts were not without some foundation, for the very same thought unluckily entered the head of that noble youth, who considered whether he might not possibly sell himself for some advantage to the other side, as he had yet no promise from Wild. But this was, by the sagacity of the latter, prevented in the morning with a profusion of promises, which showed him to be of the most generous temper in the world, with which Fireblood was extremely well satisfied, and made use of so many protestations of his faithfulness, that he convinced Wild of the justice of his suspicions. At this time an accident happened, which, though it did not immediately affect our hero, we cannot avoid relating, as it occasioned great confusion in his family, as well as in the family of Snap. It is indeed a calamity highly to be lamented when it stains untainted blood, and happens to an honourable house, an injury never to be repaired, a blot never to be wiped out, a sore never to be healed. To detain my reader no longer, Miss Theodosia Snap was now safely delivered of a male infant, the product of an amour which that beautiful, that I could say virtuous, creature had with the Count. Mr. Wild and his lady were at breakfast when Mr. Snap, with all the agonies of despair both in his voice and countenance, brought them this melancholy news. Our hero, who had, as we have said, wonderful good nature when his greatness or interest was not concerned, instead of reviling his sister-in-law, asked with a smile, who was the father? But the chaste Laetitia, we repeat, the chaste, for well did she now deserve that epithet, received it in another manner. She fell into the utmost fury at the relation, reviled her sister in the bitterest terms, and vowed she would never see nor speak to her more, then burst into tears, and lamented over her father that such dishonour should ever happen to him and herself. At length she fell severely on her husband for the light treatment which he gave this fatal accident. She told him he was unworthy of the honour he enjoyed of marrying into a chaste family, that she looked on it as an affront to her virtue, that if he had married one of the naughty hussies of the town, he could have behaved to her in no other manner. She concluded with desiring her father to make an example of the slut, and to turn her out of doors, for that she would not otherwise enter his house, being resolved never to set her foot within the same threshold with the trollop whom she detested so much the more because, which was perhaps true, she was her own sister. So violent, and indeed so outrageous, was this chaste lady's love of virtue, that she could not forgive a single slip, indeed the only one Theodosia had ever made, in her own sister, in a sister who loved her, and to whom she owed 1,000 obligations. Perhaps the severity of Mr. Snap, who greatly felt the injury done to the honour of his family, would have relented had not the parish officers been extremely pressing on this occasion, and, for want of security, conveyed the unhappy young lady to a place, the name of which, for the honour of the Snaps, to whom our hero was so nearly allied, we bury in eternal oblivion, where she suffered so much correction for her crime that the good-natured reader of the male kind may be inclined to compassionate her, at least to imagine she was sufficiently punished for a fault which, with submission to the chaste Laetitia and all other strictly virtuous ladies, it should be either less criminal in a woman to commit, or more so in a man to solicit her to it. But to return to our hero, who was a living and strong instance that human greatness and happiness are not always inseparable. He was under a continual alarm of frights and fears and jealousies. He thought every man he beheld wore a knife for his throat, and a pair of scissors for his purse. As for his own gang, particularly, he was thoroughly convinced there was not a single man amongst them who would not, for the value of 5 shillings, bring him to the gallows. These apprehensions so constantly broke his rest, and kept him so assiduously on his guard to frustrate and circumvent any designs which might be formed against him, that his condition, to any other than the glorious eye of ambition, might seem rather deplorable than the object of envy or desire. End of Book 3, Chapter 13. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox.